In this video, you'll learn React by walking through a real-world practical project. We're not just going to build something like a to-do list, we're actually going to make something that uses a real-world API, fetches data, displays data, and covers all of the important React components and features so that by the end of this video, you feel comfortable working in the framework. Now, this is not designed for complete beginners. You should have some experience with JavaScript, but this is designed to teach you React as quickly as possible by skipping over all of the stuff you really don't need to know and getting right into the important stuff and immediately applying it into a project. Now, that said, we're not going to cover the entire framework because there is a lot of stuff here, but what you'll learn in this video will cover about 90% of what you use on a day-to-day basis, give you a really solid foundation to start building React apps. Anyways, with that said, let's get into a quick demo of this application after I tell you about a great resource that you'll want to be aware of. So if you're anything like me, you probably like writing code and building apps, but you don't like designing them, especially when you're using CSS. Now, fortunately, in today's age, we don't need to write that much CSS ourselves, and that's because we can take advantage of great free resources like this one from HubSpot, which contains tons of coding templates and snippets. I put a link to it in the description where you can check it out completely for free. I was skimming through all of the free coding templates and found a ton of useful snippets for things like nav bars, CSS effects, progress bars, and button transitions. It's always helpful for me to utilize pre-built templates to learn how to properly create something and to really quickly get a functional and decent looking website running, especially because I hate working in CSS and I know I'm not alone here. Now, personally, my favorite part of this resource really is all of the CSS effects and templates that they have, because it just saves me so much time and gives me something that looks great immediately. Now, this resource and tons of others are provided for free by our video sponsor, HubSpot. So a massive thank you to them for making all of this free, and make sure to check out this resource from the link in the description. So I'm on the computer now, and I just want to give you a quick demo of exactly what it is that we'll be building. Now you can see that we've kind of got a movie search engine here, and what we'll be doing is connecting to a publicly available API that contains all kinds of movie data. This way we can display the most popular movies. That's what it's doing right now. We can favorite the movies by hovering over them and pressing this heart, and then we can search for movies. So if I search for something like the Terminator, for example, you can see that all of these results pop up. So yes, it is fairly simple, but this is going to show you a lot of different features within React, and we're going to go beyond the basics and look at things like using publicly available data, which you're almost always doing, connecting some kind of API when you're building a React frontend. Now, if I go to the favorites page here, you can see that all of my favorite movies are here, and then I can unfavorite them and remove them from this list if I want to do that. So there you go. That's what we're going to be building. I think this is pretty cool. I know you're going to learn a lot. So now let's hop over to our code editor and start writing this code. So let's get started and learn about React. Now I'm going to start with some important concepts, just going through some of the main pages in the React docs. Then we'll get right into the project and I'll show you how to set everything up. Now, as you probably know, React uses JavaScript, and when you write React code, you're writing kind of a hybrid of HTML and JavaScript. You actually write in a file extension called .jsx, which is a special syntax you'll see in just a minute. Now, React is typically used on the web, but you can use the React Native framework if you want to build applications for mobile, so like iOS, Android, etc. We're not going to cover that in this video. Okay, so the important thing that you need to understand about React is that everything revolves around something called a component. Now, a component is really just a part of your application, like a modular component aspect of the app. Here, it's giving us a great example of a component where we have kind of this little card. We have a thumbnail that might represent like a thumbnail for a video or something. And then we have some information, so like my video, my description, and then we have this like button. Now you can see here, this shows us the code for this video component. And the idea is that we can design these modular components and we can use them multiple times within our application and really separate all of the logic into smaller pieces of code so that we can kind of compartmentalize our application and make it easier to navigate and just write this code. So you'll see that what you need to get used to doing in React is kind of converting the way you think into different components. So even if we look at this web page right here, we can probably identify like this nav bar up here, for example, might be a component. This search button with this kind of pop-up here is probably a component. These different buttons, these could be different components. I know it doesn't make a ton of sense right now, but you're able to design these different kind of small components that you can plug into your application that make things just a lot easier to build. So here you have like the thumbnail component, which we're using. You have this kind of link tag that we've put here, and then you have this like button component, and all of that gets combined into this video component, which is just a JavaScript function that returns what's known as JSX code. Don't worry, I'm going to go into a deep dive. I'm going to explain all of that, but I'm just trying to show you a few examples. Now notice that we have that video component that we made right here, right? And then what we can do is we can use that video component multiple times to have multiple videos showing up on our page where all of the logic for each video is handled within that component. And here we've made a video list component that displays different videos inside of it. So that's what you kind of need to understand, is that we think in components, and everything we build is a component, and these components can have other components inside of them. And by combining these together, you create your web application. Don't worry, we'll break it all down. I'm just showing you a little bit about how this works so you get some context. Now, these components can also manage state, for example. So if this button is pressed or unpressed, and they can do all kinds of dynamic and advanced behavior that we're going to look at in just a minute. Okay, so enough of the brief and the theoretical stuff. We want to actually get into the code. The first thing we need to do to start working with React is download Node.js. Now, Node.js is going to allow us to actually create a React project. So go ahead, download Node.js, and make sure this gets added to your system path. So if you're downloading it and it says something like add to path, just check that box so that you're able to use the node command. So now that we have Node.js installed, what we're going to do is go into some kind of code editor. In my case, I'm going to work in VS Code, but truthfully, you can use anything that you want. Now from here, what we want to do is open up a new folder. So you can go to File, Open Folder, just go to your desktop or any place that you want to put this. And we're going to go React, movie tutorial or something. You can call it whatever you want. Just make some kind of folder, which is where our project is going to live. Okay. So now that we've made this folder, I'm just going to close this welcome page here. What we're going to do is run a command that will initialize the React project for us. This is going to use something called Vite. Vite is a lightweight web server that allows us to kind of run our React applications. So what we're going to do is go to our terminal. We're going to make sure we're in the same directory where we want the project to be started. So here we're going to type npm, standing for Node Package Manager, and then create Vite at latest. Okay, and we got to spell latest correctly. Now, once we do this, it's going to give us a few options here, and we need to first specify the project name. So for the project name, we can just call this front end. You can call it anything that you want, but this will just be the kind of name of the folder that gets created. And then we need to select our framework. Now we want to use React, so we're going to go with React. You can see there's a lot of options here. And then for the variant that we want to use, we're just going to use JavaScript. Now there's a bunch of options here. For example, you can use TypeScript as well, but we're going to keep it nice and simple just with normal JavaScript. Okay, so now once we do that, it's going to create a new folder for us called frontend. This is where our React project will live. So we want to go inside of this directory and start running the setup commands. So we're going to go cd, and we're going to cd into frontend. And then from the frontend directory, we're going to install the various packages that we need. Now you'll see here that what happens is when we run this command, it creates a bunch of different files for us. And one of the files it creates is this package.json file. Now this package.json file contains all of the dependencies for our application, including the React framework. So you see here it says things like React, React DOM, ESLint. You don't need to understand what all of these are, and really you don't even need to look inside of this file. But what will happen when we run the next command, which is npm install, is we will read the dependencies from our package.json and we'll simply install them to our local machine. Okay, so we're going to type npm install. I noticed that's happening at the bottom of my terminal, but npm install is the command that you need to run once you're inside of the front end directory. It's going to take a second. It will download and kind of bring all the dependencies in here. And then once we have those dependencies, you'll see that they'll show up in a new folder, and you don't need to look at them from there, but they're just required obviously for the project to run. Okay, so that just finished. Let me just clear my terminal, and you'll see that now we have this node modules folder. Now you don't need to go in this folder or look at it. I'm just kind of quickly showing it to you. This is where all of the code or all of the dependencies for our project live. And anytime we add a new package, it will get added inside of here. Okay, it will get added in package.json as well as inside of the node modules. Now from here, we've got a bunch of files. So let's start going through it, and then we can kind of walk through creating our simple React app and starting to build our project. So we have things like this ESLint configuration. You don't need to worry about that, so just ignore it. We have this index.html. This is where we'll actually inject our React code. So the way this kind of works is we have this div with the ID root, and all of the code that we're about to write, we're pretty much just going to throw that inside of this div. So React will kind of manage the DOM. It will handle all of the HTML being rendered to the page. And the way it does that is we inject the code inside of this div, and then React kind of takes control of that. So you can still write things like meta tags and links, and you can change, for example, the icon and the title of the web page here in this title page. So I could change this to, for example, movie list or something, and then when we run our React app, it will get updated. Now we also have this README file. This is just kind of explaining how to set up the project, so you don't need to worry about that. And then all of the code that we're really going to be concerned with will be inside of this src folder, which we'll get to in 1 second. Okay, we also have this public folder, which has things like the icon or the logo that we potentially would be displaying. Okay, so don't worry too much about this. Really, source is what we need to focus on, and we'll get there in 1 second. But I want to run the React application just to make sure this is working. So once we've installed all of the packages, we can run the command npm run dev. Now this is going to run a development server on our own computer and spin up the React application so we can view it on a specific port. So we're going to hit enter here on npm run dev, and you'll see that it'll show you right here where the React server is running. So you can just copy this into your browser, or you can hit Control and just click on the link, which is what I'm doing here. And you'll see that it opens up this kind of Vite plus React template app here, and you can kind of count up if you press on this button. Now we can just leave this running on our screen. I'm not going to show it the entire time, but this actually has something called hot reload, which means anytime I make a change to one of these files, so for example, I say movie list 2, if I save this, the server will automatically refresh. And if I go back to my page, I don't need to reload the page to see the change. So here you see it's now updated to movie list 2 for the title of the web page. So that's a really nice feature. You don't need to keep manually refreshing this. It will automatically update anytime you save a change to your React code. All right, so that's all great, but I'm just going to close the terminal for now. I'm going to leave the server running so I don't need to rerun this again, but I'm just closing it down. Okay, so now I'm going to close this index.html, and we're going to start looking at some of the files that it's given us here inside of this template. Now notice right away that they end in this .jsx extension. So whenever you're writing React code, something like a React component, which again we'll look at in a minute, you want to make sure that it ends in .jsx, not .js, because if you just do normal JavaScript, you're going to get an issue if you write kind of specific code. Again, you're going to see it in a minute. I'm sorry for putting everything forward in the future. Anyways, you can see here that we have this main.jsx file. Now this is where your React application begins, and you can see that what we're doing inside of this file is we're importing a few dependencies. We're looking for the root div inside of our HTML file, and we're simply rendering our React application inside of there. So we have this component called app. This is where all of our kind of React code lives, where we're going to start the application from and render everything that we need. And we just take that and we just throw it inside of the root. So that's kind of how this begins and how the code actually gets injected in the web page. Now, if we go to app.jsx, this is where we can actually start writing code. So if you look here, you might see some code that looks familiar. You have kind of some JavaScript looking code up here. We have a JavaScript function, which is actually what a component is in React. And we have this JSX code. JSX simply means kind of a combination of JavaScript and HTML. And you'll see that we have some things that look like HTML, right? We have a link, we have some images, we have this header, Vite plus React. We've got this, edit file to, make updates, etc. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to begin by clearing this file out, and I'm just going to render a single div from this component. Okay. We're going to dive into components in 1 second, but I just want to kind of start from a fresh slate here and just remove everything from this file so that it looks really simple and we're not getting confused. Okay. So all we're doing is we're importing this app.css file, and we're just rendering an empty div, which just means that's what we're going to put on the web page. This is our entire React application as of now. Okay, so now that we've got a clear slate here, I want to talk to you about JSX, so the syntax that's being returned from these components, show you a few things that we can do here and how it differs from normal HTML. We're going to get into components, we're going to start building stuff out, but kind of baby steps at least for right now. Okay, so right here we have what's known as a component. A component is really just any function in JavaScript that returns some kind of JSX code. So it really just returns something that looks like HTML. That's the way that you can think of it. So components will always start with a capital letter. So in this case, we have function app. This is the name of our component. And from the component, we're returning this div. Okay, very simple. We can return really anything that we want so long as it's JSX code. Now, the criteria for something being JSX is that it needs to have some kind of parent element. So in this case, we're just returning some div. This is the only thing that we have, but I couldn't, for example, go here and try to return another div that's at the same level. Notice that even though we have the braces here, we're getting an error. And the reason for that is whenever we return something, it needs to have just one parent element, one kind of root element being returned, and then it can have anything that we want inside of there. Okay, so we have a div, and for now, we're just going to return a very simple paragraph, and we can just say something like hello world. And if we save this, you'll see that in the middle of our screen, we now get hello world. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand with JSX. When you're returning it from a component, there needs to be just one root element that you're returning. You can't return multiple kind of at the same level. However, what if we wanted to have maybe another div? Maybe we're going to set up some kind of flexbox container or something, and we don't necessarily want to have some kind of parent element. Well, if that's the case, what we can do is return something called a fragment, okay? Now, a fragment is really just kind of a placeholder for that parent element. This is what a fragment looks like right here. It's simply just an empty HTML tag. That's the way that you can look at it. Now, this solves that problem where maybe we wanted two divs like this, but we didn't necessarily want a div parent. In this case, we can just return what's called a fragment, and it's just kind of this empty tag, okay, that wraps these different components so that we can return them. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense so far. Now, what I want to do is rather than writing this 2 times, I probably just want to wrap this in a reusable component and then just render that component twice. Now, I know this example doesn't make a ton of real world sense. It's just because I need to go through the basics before we can get into the actual project. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make a new kind of dummy component to show you how it works. So if we want to make a component, we just give a function a name with a capital letter. So in this case, function text. Then we can do our set of braces. And from here, all we have to do is just return something. So I'm simply just going to return a div that has hello world inside of it. Okay, let me just format this so that's a little bit easier to see. Okay, great. So we've just defined a component. And now if we want to use the component, we use it just like we use any normal kind of HTML element. So what I can do is I can simply write the name of the component, and then I can just end the tag like this. So I can say text and then slash like this. I can save. And when I reload, notice that my text is still appearing. So what I can actually do is I can put this component 2 times, and now I'm just showing 2 text components inside of my app. Okay, so you can see how this can get really useful really fast because we can make different components for all the different parts of our user interface, and then we can combine them together, and it makes it really easy for us to understand what's going on because I can just read the names of the components in this root component, for example, and I can kind of drill into the exact area that I'm looking for rather than having just a ton of HTML all in a single file. Okay, so this is the basics, very basics on a component. We define something with a capital letter, we return some JSX code, and then we're displaying that 2 times. Now, sometimes with our components, we want to actually display something unique. So maybe we want to have some kind of parameter, some property that we pass to the component that customizes its behavior. In this case, we have a text component. And for the text component, maybe we want to change the color or we want to change the text that's actually being displayed. So what we can do is we can add what's known as a prop. Okay, now prop stands for property. And the way this works is I can put a set of curly braces here inside of my component, and I can define different props that I want to accept. So I can say something like text. Now, when I do this, this indicates that I'm able to pass this text keyword to my component, and I can dynamically kind of use the value that's passed in, just like we do in a normal function. So now, rather than rendering hello world, I can simply render some text. And just to make it not super confusing, let's just change this to something like, I don't know, display or something, just so that it's not the same word when I'm explaining. Okay, so now what I can do is I can go here and I can say display is equal to something like hello, and I can say display is equal to, you know, what's up. And now when I save this, notice that the first text component shows what's up, and the second text component shows hello, because we're dynamically displaying what we're passing as the display prop. Now we can pass as many props as we want. These props can have different values. They don't just need to be text. And that's really the basics on components. Now, another thing to understand with components is that you don't necessarily need to end them in line like this. I can technically do this, okay? So I can just end text like this. When I refresh, you can see everything is totally fine, and it just works the same as before. There is actually a more advanced property where you can put things inside of the component, but we're not gonna look at that right now. I just wanted to mention that this is another way to kind of close the components, and you'll see that frequently, especially if you're using components from a component library, for example, because the great thing about React is that you can use other people's components that they've built. Anyways, we probably want to go beyond this. We don't just want to display text. This is kind of a silly component to write. I was just doing it as an example. We want to start working on our project. Now for our project, we want to display a bunch of movies, as you saw in the demo. So the first thing I'm thinking about when I want to build a project like this is, okay, what type of components do I need? Now, right away, a component that we're going to want to have in our application is one that displays different information about movies. For example, it shows the image, it shows the name of the movie, the release date, and also we need to display if that movie is one of our favorites or not, like with the heart icon in the kind of the top right-hand corner, if you remember that from the demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new component, but this time I'm going to make it in a new file. So the best practice for React is that you separate out things like your styles. You can see we have CSS files here, your components, your different services, things that are calling APIs into different folders. So I'm going to make a folder here called components. Okay, and inside of components, I'm going to make a new file, and this new file is going to be called movie card.jsx. Okay, now this is where I'm going to display, or I'm going to write the component specifically for displaying a movie, and you'll see immediately how this makes our code a lot more readable and maintainable. Okay, so if I want to make a new component inside of here, what I need to do is I need to define a function. Okay, so I'm going to say function movie card. And for my movie card, I need to think right away, okay, I want this movie card to work for any possible movie, and I want it to display information about that movie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to accept a prop here in my movie card, which is information about the movie. Now we'll assume that this is going to be an object, and this object might contain fields like the release date or the title or the image. We don't quite yet know because we haven't gone that far in the project, but we want to think, okay, what information do I need to accept dynamically in this component? And in this case, we need to know information about the movie, so we'll just assume that's going to come in an object. Okay, now right away, what we can do inside of this component is we can start returning some JSX. So we're going to start always with some kind of root component. In this case, I'm going to make this a div, and I'm going to start adding some CSS classes here because I'm going to give you access to a bunch of style sheets that you can just copy into your code that are going to make this look a lot better later. So you'll notice right away that what I'm going to define is actually a class name. Notice I didn't just put class, which you might be used to in HTML. That's because in JSX, rather than having class, which is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, we use class name so we don't get any conflicts. Okay, so whenever you want to define the CSS class, you just use class name rather than class. Now for this div, I'm going to call this a movie card. Now what I'm doing is I'm designing the component that represents a movie here, okay? And we can imagine we would display this multiple times on our website, which we'll look at in just a minute. Okay, so we've got this div, and then we're gonna want another div inside of here, which is gonna display maybe the image. So I'm gonna say class name for this one is equal to movie-poster, okay? Then inside of this div, I'm gonna put an image, okay? For the image, we'll have some kind of source, and whenever you want to put something that's dynamic like a variable, you can put a set of braces, and now I can directly embed a variable inside of here. So I can say image, source, and then maybe I wanted this to be movie.url. Okay, we don't know exactly what this will be yet, but if that's what we wanted, we could say movie.url, and now we're treating this like a variable, which will be kind of accessible to the source. Okay, then I'm going to say the alt will be movie.title. Okay, so that's our image inside of that part of the div. And what we're going to do below this is we're going to make another div. Okay, now for this div, we're going to have class name equal to, and this is going to be the movie-overlay. And inside of this div, we're going to have a button. Now this is going to be the button that allows us to like the movie. So it'll be like that kind of heart button. And for the button, we can say the class name is equal to, and then this is going to be the favorite-btn. And what we can do is add an onClick event. So just like we would in normal JavaScript or normal HTML, when we click the button, we want to be able to respond to that event. So we can actually add a JavaScript function here, which will be triggered when we click this button. So to do that, we can just make a function inside of our function here. So I can say something like function on, like, or on favorite click or something, call it whatever you want, doesn't really matter. And now I can simply pass this function name to my onClick, and now this function will get called anytime this button gets pressed. Okay, and then anything inside of this function will run. So for now, we can just do an alert and say clicked, just so that we know it's working. Okay, now inside of the button, we probably want to have some text. So I'm just going to copy in this kind of heart text right here. You can put anything you want. You can find this by just looking up like, heart icon online, or you can just copy the code. I'm going to leave a link to the GitHub in the description. But anyways, we're just going to put a little bit of a white heart. Okay. So now we've got part of our poster, part of our movie, but I want to go outside of my movie poster, inside of my movie card, and I want to write a little bit more. We're almost done, but I want to write a bit more for my component. So I'm going to say div class name is equal to, and this is going to be the movie info. And inside of here, I'm just going to add some information about my movie. So I'm going to have an H3, and I'm going to embed inside here my movie.title. Now notice, because I want to use a variable here coming from my prop, I actually use the brace, okay? So when I do the brace, it means I'm treating whatever's inside of the braces as a variable. If I didn't have the braces, then we would just render the string movie title, which is not what we want. We want to actually get the movie title from our property, okay? And then lastly, we're going to have a paragraph tag, and we're going to say movie.release underscore date. And then for now, we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so this is our movie card. We've just defined it. And now if we want to start using it, we need to export it from this file. So whenever we want to access something from another file in JavaScript here, we're going to export this. So to do that, at the bottom of our code, we can type export default, and then the name of our component, which is the movie card. Okay, so now this will be available as a default import. I'll show you how that works in just 1 second. We also could just denote the function as exported up here, but if we do that, we need to import specifically this function name because it's not a default export, it's a named export. We're gonna look at that in a second. Okay, anyways, we've got this component, we've defined it, we wanna see it on the screen, we wanna start messing with it. So to do that, we're gonna go into app.jsx, and we're going to import the code that we just wrote, and we're going to start rendering some movies as components. So to do that, we're going to go up to the top of our program, and we're going to say import movie card. You can call this anything that you want, from /components/ and then the name of our file, which is movie card. Okay. Now, because we added this export default, we can simply write the import like this. If we didn't have the default export, and I specified an export like this, so I had, export the function, I would need to actually surround this in braces, okay? So this is called a named export, and then this is the default export. So sorry, let's go back to what we had here, where we had the export default down here, okay? So it's just common to use the default export for your function. All right, so now we've imported this, and what we want to do is display our movie. So to display our movie, we can say, okay, we want to display a movie card, but in order for this to work, we need to pass the prop, which is movie. Okay, so we're going to say movie is equal to, and I'm going to put an object here. Now to put an object, I can put another set of braces, because the first set of braces defines that we're denoting a variable, and then the second set of braces will be the object that we're going to pass. Now for our movie, we can have some title, so we can say this is going to be, Tim's film or something, and then we can have the release date. I forget what we called it, so we can go check it out. Okay, so it's release underscore date. Okay, so let's fix that. And then this can be equal to, 2024. And then what else did we have here? We had the URL, and for now, the URL, we're just not gonna put anything. Okay, so notice when I do this, now we get our movie. It looks a little bit weird, but we've got this kind of button here, and when we click on it, it says clicked, and we've got Tim's film and 2024. Now, the beautiful thing about these components is that I can now display them multiple times. So I can now have this, and I can say this is, Joe's film in 2020, and now I get the exact same component showing up, except with these new dynamic values. Awesome. So that's kind of the first part here, with our components. We defined a component, we can dynamically render some information, and I want to show you some more kind of cool things that we could do here in terms of rendering and displaying stuff to the screen before we get into anything too complicated. So a very common thing you're going to see when you're working in React is something known as conditional rendering. Now, this is some code that you can write where you can essentially render one component or the other based on some kind of condition. So let's say I have some variable here and I have movie number. Okay. And maybe this is equal to movie number 1. Now, first of all, this is perfectly valid. You can just write any JavaScript code you normally would before the return statement, and you can have as much logic as you want happening inside of the component before you eventually get to this return. Anyways, it's possible that we might only want to display one of these movies, and we want to display maybe this first one if the movie number is 1, and the second one if the movie number is 2. Now, in order to do that, we could just write, if statements up here. We can say if, movie number, so let's type this, is equal to 1, then we're going to return, the movie card. But the issue with that is that if we have a more complex user interface, we probably want this condition to apply just inside of here, so we can return other parts of our user interface as well. So what I can do is I can write something like this. I can say movie number is equal to 1, question mark, okay? And then I'm gonna copy this, and then I can put a colon, I can put my other component, I can close the bracket. Let me just format this so you guys can read it. And what we've just done is set up a conditional render. Now, what I'm doing is I'm checking some conditions. So I'm saying, okay, movie number is equal to 1. So if movie number is equal to 1, then whatever I put after the question mark, which is this component, will get rendered on the screen. Otherwise, which comes after the colon, will display this component. Okay, so we're just conditionally rendering it based on this. Now, if I change this to say movie number equal to 2, you see now that it changes to Joe's film. Okay, and if I change it to 1, you can see it changes back to Tim's film. So that's one way that we can conditionally render. Now, another way, let me just get rid of this here, is to do something like this. So I can say movie number is equal to 1, and then I can put some component. Now, when I do this, it works a little bit differently. I don't have an if else. I just have, okay, if this thing here is true on the left side, then go ahead and display this. Okay, it has to do with short circuiting in JavaScript, if you know what that is, but this is something that's perfectly valid. So we can say, okay, movie number is equal to 1. If that's the case, go ahead and display this. That's pretty much it. Okay, so that's what you need to know about conditional rendering. You're going to see that quite a bit inside of your JSX code, where certain things will be displayed only if some condition is true. All right, so all of that is great, but we're going to get into a slightly more complex example here. So I'm just going to remove whatever we did inside of app, and I'm actually going to make a new folder here inside of SRC called pages. Now, the reason for this is that these components are typically things that will be displayed on the page and make up parts of our user interface, but we also can have unique pages that we can navigate between using some kind of page router, which we're going to look at in 1 second. So what I want to do for now is I want to make a home page for our site. So I'm going to say home.jsx as a new file. And inside of here, this is where I'm going to display kind of a list of all of the movies. And then I'm going to have another page. We'll just make it while we're here. And this is going to be favorites. Okay, .jsx. Now the favorites will display all of our favorites, and the home will just display kind of the ability to search for movies and to, well, favorite them. Okay, we've still got our movie card, which we can use later on, and we will customize this a bit in a second. But for now, I want to work on this home page. Okay, so let's work on a home page. And on the home page, I'm going to display multiple different movies, and I'm going to have kind of a search form set up so that users can search for movies. All right, so to start here, we're going to make a component again, and we're going to call this home. And this component is just going to contain pretty much the entire user interface for the home page. Okay, so inside of home, we're just going to return some JSX, and then we're going to add some logic to this later on. So inside of here, we're just going to return a div. Okay, the div is going to have a class name, and this is just going to be equal to home. Now at the top, I'm going to make a variable inside of my function called movies. And the idea is I'm going to have an array here that contains some different movies. And rather than rendering all the movies individually, I want to render them kind of dynamically. So whether I have 10 movies or 100 movies or 200 movies, doesn't matter. I will just display a movie card for every single one of those. Okay. So in order to do that, we're just going to define some movies here. So we can have maybe an ID for the movie and say this is ID 1. We can have the title, and we're just going to go, this is, John Wick or something. We'll have the release underscore date. No, I don't know when this was released, 2020 or something. Okay, and let's just copy this and change some of these fields, and let's add a few different movies just so that we have some unique values that we can look at. Okay, so let's go with something like Terminator. Okay, I don't know when that was released. Okay, let's go with The Matrix. Okay, same thing. It's probably before I was born. You know what? 3 movies for now is fine. Okay, so we've got 3 movies, and the idea is what I probably want to do here is display all of these movies, maybe in some kind of row or something. So how can I do that? Well, I can use something in JavaScript or in JSX here called .map to dynamically render typically an array of values. So the way it works is something like this. I'm just going to make a div to put these inside of. I'm going to say the class name is equal to, and we're going to go with the movies-grid, because we're going to have a grid of movies. And I'm going to start by kind of writing these braces because I'm about to define an expression in JavaScript. So I'm going to say movies.map. Okay. Now what I can do is I can write movie. So this is the parameter that I'm accepting. And then I can put an arrow function. And what comes after the arrow function is the component that I want to return for every single instance of my movie. So let me just write it out and then I'll kind of walk you through it. So we're going to say that we want to return a movie card. Now, if we want to use the movie card component, which is the one that we defined here, we need to import it. So we're going to say import movie card. Okay, and we're going to say .. and then this is going to be components / and then movie card. Now we use the .. because we need to go back 1 level because we're currently in the pages directory to the source directory. Then we need to look inside of components and then look inside of our movie card. Okay, so now we've imported that. So now I can use my movie card. And what I'm going to do is just pass to the movie card my movie. So I'm going to say that my movie is equal to the movie that I have right here. And also what I need to do is add something called a key, which I will discuss in 1 second. Okay, so we're going to say key is equal to movie.id. And let me just format this so that we can read it a little bit easier. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're using the .map function, which is going to iterate over all of the values inside of our array. For every single value, it's going to take it and pass it to this function. This function then needs to return some JSX code. In this case, we're returning a component. And this now means we're going to display this component for every single movie. So it's just going to kind of put them on the screen. We don't have any styling right now, but it will just make them appear. Okay. Now, whenever you do this, you need to add a .key property to the component you're returning. The reason for that is that React needs to know which component to update based on the interactions that happen with the web page. So we need to mark every single one of these components with a unique identifier so that React can kind of handle all of the state updates that it typically does. I don't want to get into all of the complexity right now, but what you need to remember is that if you're dynamically rendering kind of multiple things like we're doing with .map, you need to add this key property even if I haven't added it here. So I haven't added it as a prop, it's just something that I add to the component so that React can identify this component compared to the other ones that we're rendering. Okay. Now we want to see this. So what I'm going to do is say export default the home page. I'm going to show you how we route between the pages in just a minute. But for now, to keep things simple, I'm going to go to app.jsx, which remember is the main component that we're rendering on our web page. We're going to import the home component. So we're going to say import home from, and then this is going to be pages or /pages/home. Okay, and then we're just going to display the home component here. Okay, now the home component doesn't take any props. And notice that as soon as I display the home component, we now get all of our movies popping up on the screen because we dynamically rendered them using .map. All right, so this is fine, but I want to add some more functionality to this homepage. I don't just want to display the movies. I also want to display some kind of form or some kind of input in order for us to actually be able to search for movies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form and I'm going to put that above our movies grid. Now for the form, I'm going to have an onSubmit. Okay, and this is going to call a function so that we can handle kind of the form submission, which we'll look at in a second. We're then going to have class name is equal to the search-form. And inside of the form, we're going to define an input. Okay, now the input is going to be type is equal to text. Okay, we're going to have a placeholder, and this is going to be equal to search for movies, ... And we're going to have a class name, and this is going to be equal to the search-input. Okay, we're gonna add a few other things here in 1 second, but let me just format this. Why is it getting mad at us? Oh, it's because we need a function for onSubmit. Okay, so let's just define a function here. I'm gonna do it in another way, which you'll see quite commonly. So I'm gonna say const handle search, and this is gonna be equal to a JavaScript arrow function. Okay, normal function, arrow function, doesn't matter. And here I'm gonna say handle search. Okay, so we'll just call that function. All right, so now I know this doesn't look very nice, but you can see we get this kind of text input popping up here, and I can type inside of there. That's great, but I do want to format this and make this a bit smaller. And I want to add a button so that we can submit the form. So I'm gonna say button. Okay, we're gonna end the button. We're gonna say type is equal to submit. We're gonna give this a name. So we'll say class name is equal to the search button. Okay. And we'll just have the button say search. We're gonna add some CSS styling later, so don't worry about that for now. But I just am adding the classes so that when we bring in the style sheets, everything will work. Okay, so now we have this, kind of search for movies, and we have this search button that I can press on that submits the form. However, what I wanna do is I wanna talk to you now about state. So how do we handle dynamic parts of our components, and how do we maintain things like state, like maybe a count of something, or in this case, the text that the user's typing in? Now, state is something where once it's updated, the component will change and re-render itself to show the new state. So you're gonna see what I mean in 1 second, but I'm gonna kind of just show you a quick example of state. We're just gonna get right into it. So I'm gonna go up to the top of my program, and I'm gonna say import, and inside of braces, I'm gonna say use state from React. Okay, now this is something referred to as a hook. You don't need to understand what that means, but what we can do here is we can define a piece of state which can handle kind of logic or, well, state that's happening in our component. So what I can do is I can say const, and I'm gonna do a array here, and for the array I'm gonna have a search query, and I'm gonna have a set search query. Now this is pretty much always the convention. You have what you want the name of the state to be, and then this is actually gonna be a function which will allow you to update the state. You then are gonna write use state, and inside of use state, you're gonna define what you want the default value of this state to be. Just to give you a sense of what we're doing, we're gonna define some state which will store what the user types in this input field so that we can use it later on within our JSX here or within any logic that we have. And we can actually, for example, call an API with that search string, or we can clear the string later, but we wanna be able to actually track it. So whenever you're writing something like a form, you're always gonna have all of the form elements kind of connected to a piece of state. And then that piece of state you can utilize within your component however you want. So again, you'll see what I mean in 1 second. So this defines the state, and this is the function that we can use to update the state. And anytime we update the state, this component is gonna re-render itself and update based on this kind of state change, okay? So when you change the state, you can re-render the component and update it on screen. Now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my input, and I'm gonna say that my value is equal to, and then this is gonna be the search query, because I wanna connect this component to this search query state. Now this is fine, but you'll notice that if I save and refresh here, I actually can't type anything into my input box. The reason for that is the value is locked on this state, but I'm not updating the state when something changes in my input box. So what I need to do is I need to define this function called onChange, and this onChange function is gonna take the variable e, just going to be an inline arrow function, and we're going to say set query string or set search query. This is going to be e.target.value, which is whatever the updated version of this search box is. This might seem weird, but this is how you update the state from an input element. Okay, so we say onChange, we take in whatever the change is, we get the target.value, and we set our state equal to that. So what's going to happen now is when I start typing, it will update. What's actually happening in the background is anytime we make a change to this input box, this function is called, we update this state, and then the state automatically updates the page, which will then display whatever we've typed inside of this input box. Okay, so now that we've defined that, what we can do if we want is when we press on handle search, we could actually use that string because we've stored it in the state. So I can go here, and I can say something like alert, and I'll just alert whatever the search query is, just so we see it on screen. Okay, so now if I type something, I say hello, and I press this search button, it says hello because that's what I typed, right? If I say, what's up, and then I press this, it says what's up because that's what I typed. Okay, now you notice that actually what's being typed is getting cleared when I press the submit button, and that's because the submit button by default will refresh the page. So if we want to stop that behavior, we can write this we can take in this variable e, and we can say e.prevent default. Prevent default just means prevent the default behavior so that it doesn't actually update the page. Okay, so if I refresh this now and I type something like hello world and search, notice it stays here afterwards because we prevented the default behavior. If we wanted to, inside of this function, we could change the state ourselves. So we could say, set search query, and we can set this back to an empty string, or if we just want to see it working, we can make it like a bunch of dashes, for example. And now if I refresh and I type, hello, and then search, notice that now it gets changed to a bunch of dashes because we called this function and we updated the state. Well, we updated the state, the UI, or at least this component got re-rendered, so it showed us that new value now appearing inside of the input. Okay? Hopefully this is making a little bit of sense, but this is kind of a basic introduction to state in React. Okay, so now that we've learned about the basics of state, I want to go a step further and show you how the state can be used to kind of display different values inside of the component. So for example, we might want to only display movies now if their title actually matches with what we've searched for. So what we can do here is we can go to our movies.map and we can adjust this now. So I'm actually going to change this so that rather than, or actually we'll leave it like this, so that I have a conditional render, sorry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say movie.to lowercase, I believe that's the function, movie.title.to lowercase, dot starts with, and we're going to take in whatever the search text is. So what is this? This is the search query. And then I'm going to say, and this component right here. I just saved this so we can see it a little bit better, but what I'm doing now is I'm going to use this state to conditionally render this movie card only if the beginning of the movie title begins with the search text. Now, when we don't have any text, then this will work. It'll display all of the movies. But if I start typing something like John, you can see now it shows John Wick. If I type T for Terminator, it shows the Terminator. If I do, Matrix, well, that's not going to work because it's not starts with, but if I do TH, it shows the Matrix. And you see that my UI is being updated every time my state changes. So it's very important to understand that when the state gets changed by calling this function, the entire part of this component or this component itself and anything inside of this component will be automatically updated and re-rendered to the screen. Okay, so each time I type, since the state changed, we're going to rerun all the code that's inside of this component here. The state will stay the same. It will maintain what the state was before, but everything else will be reran, right? And then we are going to return the new version of the UI. So this is an important thing that a lot of people get mixed up with in React. When a state change occurs, the entire component is reran or re-rendered. So if we just define something as a normal variable and we don't put it in the state, then whatever its value was changed to will be lost as soon as the component is re-rendered because it's going to be redefined again completely from scratch. So if you want to have state that persists across reruns or across re-renders, you need to make sure that you define it in state like this. If we change the search query and we didn't have it in this type of state and we were just using a normal variable definition, then this would never be actually updated because every time we re-render the component, it would get reset back to the original value. So we need to use this state to persist whatever it is we want to store within this component. Now, this is only persisted when the web page hasn't been refreshed. So if I refresh the page, then the state will get reset. And that's why we're going to talk about how you load in the state properly and all kinds of other things that you can do. But hopefully that's a decent example of kind of how the state works and why we put it here. So now we can use it down here, for example, and conditionally render different movies. Now that's not how we're actually going to do the movie search. So I'm going to remove this for now because we're going to use an API to do that. But I just want to show it to you because I want to go kind of step by step, understand React is confusing. And I don't want to rush through anything yet. So now that we've looked at this, I want to talk to you about page routing. I promise we're going to really get into the meat of the project in a minute, but there is a lot of stuff to cover. So notice that we have two pages, this favorite page and this home page. So let's go into our favorite page and let's just write some very basic code. So we're going to say, what is it? Favorite, okay, const favorite. And inside of here, we're just going to return a very simple div. Okay, we can say the class name is equal to, and this is going to be favorites-empty. Okay, let's spell favorites the American way, not the Canadian way. Let's add an H2, and we're going to say no favorite movies yet. Okay. And then we can just add some text, and we can say start adding movies to your favorites, and they will appear here. Okay, so very, very simple component. We're going to export this. So we're going to say export default favorite. Now, as you've probably seen with web pages before, you can go to like, /home or /favorites, right? And you can navigate the website using these slash roots. So how do you do that in React? Well, the way to do that in React is to set up something known as the React router. Now, this is another package that you need to install. So what we're going to do is shut down our server by hitting Control-C. If you hit Control-C, that will close the web server. And then you're going to type npm install react-router -DOM. Okay, if you install React Router DOM, then you're going to be good to go to follow along with the rest of what I'm going to show you. Okay, so we're going to say npm install React Router DOM. That will get installed now. It'll get added into our package.json and in our node modules folder. Now, what we want to do to set up our React router is the following. So we want to go into our main.jsx file, and we just need to wrap this app component with something that provides the ability to route. Okay, it's something known as a context, but we don't need to get into that too much. So we're going to say import, and we're going to import the browser router from, and this is the React router DOM. Okay, this is another component, one that's not built by us, and we can say browser router, and then we can just take our app and we can put it inside of here. Now, when we put the app inside of this, what it does is it gives us the ability to change components that we're rendering on screen based on the slash route that we're going to for our web page. Okay, so you just need to wrap the app component in order for what we're about to do next to work. Okay, so now that we've wrapped it in main.jsx, we're going to go to app.jsx. Now, inside of app.jsx, we can create a router, and this router can allow us to define where we should go and what component we should display based on the slash route that we go to. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to just define a main here. Okay, and for the main, we're just going to say class name is equal to main-content, and we're going to define this routes. Okay, now we need to import routes, so we're going to say import, and we're going to import routes and route from, and then this is going to be just React router DOM. Okay. Now, inside of these routes, we can define each individual path or route, and then we can have like, slash favorites or slash home or whatever mapping to a component that we want to display on screen. So it's really quite simple. We can define a route like this. Okay. We can just end it in line. For the route, you're going to define a path. So in this case, we can just define the default path, and we can say that this maps to the element, and that element is the home component. Okay, that's it. So we're just saying, hey, we want to go to the slash path. The element we want to display when we go to slash is home. So all that means is we're just going to display that component on screen. Okay, and then we can do the same thing here for favorites. So we have slash favorites, and then rather than the element being home, this will be favorite, or yeah, did I call it favorite or favorites? Okay, so this should be favorites. So let's just fix that name. And then we can display the favorites component, and notice this automatically got imported for me from pages/favorites. Okay, so now if I refresh this, we need to make sure we rerun our server, sorry, because I shut it down. So we're going to type npm run dev again, reload, refresh. Okay, and if I change the route up top here to be slash favorites like that, notice that it brings me to the favorites page. And then if I change this to just be a normal slash, it brings me back to home. Okay, so this is how you set up a basic router. You can add as many paths as you want here. You can also have nested paths, but we're not going to get into that complexity here. And now what we're going to do that we've done this is we're going to create a simple navbar. We're going to render it inside of this component, so we have a way to switch between the home page and the favorites page. Okay, so let's make the navbar component. We're going to start going a little bit faster here, guys. I know it's been slow, but I just want to make sure I cover everything. Okay, so I'm going to make a new file inside of my components, and we're going to call this navbar.jsx. Now, inside of navbar, this is just going to act as a navbar. It's going to be very simple. So let's close some of this so it's easier to see. We're going to start by making our component. So we're going to say function navbar. All right, for the navbar, we're going to return a nav element. Okay, This is going to be class name equal to navbar. And then we're going to have a div. Okay, now we're going to say class name is equal to, and this is going to be the navbar dash brand. Okay, and we're going to put a link. Now this link comes from React router DOM. So you can see the import got added for me. It says import a link from React router DOM. This acts like a normal hyperlink except to something on your own web page. So we can say link to is equal to slash, and then inside of the link, we can just put any text we want. So we can say something like, movie app. Okay, this will be on kind of the left side of our navbar. Then we can have another div. We can say the class name here is equal to kind of navbar dash links. Okay, we can then specify a link. This needs to be in capital, sorry, so let's fix that. For the link, we're going to say to equals slash, and this is going to be class name, if we spell this correctly, equal to, and this is going to be nav dash link, and then this one is going to be home, and then we can copy this, paste it, and change this. So we're going to favorites, and then this will say favorites like that. Okay, so now we've created a navbar. We're going to export the navbar. So we're going to say export default navbar, and we're going to throw it on our web page. To do that, we're going to go to the home component. We're going to import it. So we're going to say import, or sorry, not the home component. My apologies, guys. We're going to go to the app component because we want this display to display for the entire web page, not just our home page. And we're going to say import navbar from ./components/navbar. Okay, now we're just going to make another div. Okay, we're going to wrap this whole thing in the div, and we are going to render our navbar. Okay, so now if we save, you can see that we have a navbar up here. It doesn't look great. It says movie app, home, and favorites. If I click on home, brings me here. Click on favorites, brings me here. Home goes here. The movie app goes to home, and you can see that we can navigate by kind of clicking on these links. Okay, so if you want to navigate from some kind of link, you can use this link. There's other ways to programmatically navigate when you press on a button or something like that. Again, you can look that up. We don't need that right now, but I just wanted to make a simple navbar, and you can see how we've kind of separated things out now. And when we look at our main app component, it's quite simple, and it's very easy for us to figure out where code lives. Inside of home, inside of favorites, inside of navbar, you can see it's very clear to kind of figure out what's going on. So now that we've looked at some simple page navigation, I want to get into doing a little bit of styling just so the web page looks kind of decent. And then we're going to add all of the logic in terms of actually displaying the movies. Again, I know it's slow. I promise we're going to get there. We've just kind of setting up the base here, and I'm teaching you step by step the important concepts. Okay, so what we're going to do is we obviously want to make this look nice. Now, if we go to our files, you can see that we have kind of app.jsx, main.jsx, etc. And we have these style sheets. Inside of here, this is just some default styling that came with the template. And you'll notice that if we go to main.jsx, for example, we've imported index.css, and that just means that we're actually going to load this style sheet. And if we've gone to app.jsx, we've imported app.css. So it's common to have a different style sheet for each one of your components, named the same thing as that component. But what we're going to do for now is we're just going to make a new folder called CSS. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to provide you all of the styling for this web page, so we don't need to write it from scratch, because it just takes a really long time, and it's really not the purpose of this tutorial. So I have it all in a file on my local computer, but all of these files that you see are going to be available to download from the link in the description. So you can go to the GitHub page, and within GitHub, you can look into the same directory structure. All the code in this video will be here, and you can just go to the CSS folder, and you can simply copy all of these files. You can just download them as a zip folder, or you can kind of copy them one by one and paste them into your computer, however you want to do it. But what you want to do is just take all these files. They're going to look exactly like this, and you just want to put them inside of this CSS folder. So I'm going to do that just so we get app, favorite, home, index, movie card, and navbar all inside of CSS. So bear with me while I do that. Okay, so you can see that I've added all of these files, and I'm just going to remove the index.css and the app.css from my project because now I have new ones inside of this CSS folder. Now, when I do that, if we refresh here, we're going to get an error saying that it can't load the app.css because, well, this doesn't exist anymore. So we just need to change these imports to import from ./css/app.css. And then same thing in our main.jsx. we're going to change this to be ./css/index.css. Okay, so now you can see it kind of gets fixed a little bit. Now there are some more style sheets we need to import. So from our components, we're just going to import them. So from navbar, we're going to say import, and this is going to be ./css/navbar.css. Okay. Why is it saying that doesn't exist? It's because navbar has a lowercase b. Okay, let's fix that. And sorry, this should be ./css/navbar.css. Okay, now you can see the navbar kind of looks a little bit better. We're going to go into home and we're going to import this. So we're going to say import, and this is going to be ./css/home.css. Okay, we're going to go to favorites, same thing. We're going to say import and then ./css/favorites, or what did I call it? Yeah, favorites.css. Okay, now you can see it kind of looks a little bit better. And do we have anything else? Yes, we have the movie card. So let's go to our movie card and let's import this. I'm going to say import ./css/moviecard.css. Okay, so now things look a little bit better. If we go back to home, you can see the movie cards are kind of appearing here. I know they don't look ideal because we don't have the images, but they are showing up. And if I make this larger, you can see that it kind of scales and we get like this nice row grid system. You can read the CSS if you want, but I just wrote it all for us so that we don't need to kind of go into all of that. Okay, perfect. So that's that for the styling. Now that we've got the styling done, we want to get into some of the complex stuff where we actually start fetching these movies from an API. This is going to allow us to show a lot more complex behavior and for me to talk about something known as useEffect, which is something that we can kind of run right when the component loads. So basically what we want to do is from our homepage here, we want to display a list of movies. But we don't want to just have to write the movies like this. We want to actually get them from a real source. So we're going to use a publicly available API that contains a bunch of movies, and we're going to grab the most popular movies and simply display them. Then we're going to use the search feature from that API to search for movies and to display those search results. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. You're going to learn a lot here, and this goes really beyond a lot of the beginner tutorials that you'll see on YouTube commonly that cover this stuff. So as I mentioned, what we're going to do now is use an API to fetch all of our movie data so that we don't have to manually display our own movies. Now, the way that we can do that is we can go to this website right here called themoviedatabase.org. I'm going to leave a link to this in the description. Now, this has a free API that we're able to use, but in order to use the API, we need to get something known as an API key. So what you're going to do is go to this page, you're going to create a new account, should be up from the top right hand corner here. You can see I'm signed in as techwithtim123. It's free, just make sure you confirm your email address. And then what we're going to do is go to the settings, okay? So make a new account, go to settings. From settings, we're going to be looking for our API key. So to find this, we can go to API, okay? And then notice my API key is just showing here. I'm going to delete this account after, so don't worry about that. Anyways, what you're going to need to do in order to get access to the API key is fill out a form. So there's a very short form. It doesn't really matter what you put there. You can just put any information that you want and just accept the terms and conditions. Once you do that, it should give you access to this API key. It might take a minute for it to be approved, and then you can just copy the key. Okay, so we're just going to copy this key from this page. Again, you go to API, fill out the form, just wait a second, and it should give you this key. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go and we're gonna create a new folder. So rather than just having all these, we're gonna go in source and we're gonna create a folder called services. Now inside of here, we're gonna make a new file called api.js. Now notice that I didn't use JSX, I'm just using JS because I'm just gonna put some normal JavaScript functions in here, which are gonna be responsible for calling our API. It's usually good practice to create a separate file that contains all of your API calls so that you can keep kind of all of the networking operations or stuff related to the API in a separate file and find it easily. Okay, so we're going to create that file, and inside of here, we're going to define two variables. Now we're going to do these in all capitals. I'm going to say const API key is equal to, and I'm going to paste the API key I just got. And then I'm going to say const and then base underscore URL is equal to, and I'm just going to specify the URL here. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the details of the API and kind of how it works and how you find all these endpoints, but pretty much with this movie database API, you're able to do things like search for movies, get details on movies, list all of the popular movies, and we're just going to be using two operations specifically. The first operation is going to be searching for movies, and the second is just going to be displaying today's popular movies. Now, this is the base endpoint or the base URL for this API. So if we want to send a request, we send a request to this URL, and then slash, and then whatever the operation is that we want. So slash search or slash popular or something like that, okay? So we specify these two in variables, and now we're gonna create some functions which will perform those two operations. So the first thing I wanna be able to do is I wanna get the most popular movies. So I'm gonna export this function so we can use it somewhere else. I'm gonna say export const, and then this is gonna be get popular movies, and this is gonna be equal to async, and then I'm gonna have a function, and inside of here, I'm gonna write a request. Okay, now the async function just means that this is asynchronous and it's gonna take a second before we get the result. So we need to put this keyword here so that we can await this function in our components, which you'll see in a minute. The basic idea is we're gonna write the code here, but then inside of our components, we're gonna call these functions, wait until we get some result, and then we'll display that result as the movies on screen. Okay, so here we're gonna say const response is equal to, and we're gonna say await fetch. Okay, now fetch is a function that you can use to send a network request. In this case, we're gonna be sending a request and we're gonna use the backticks actually, and we're gonna embed inside of here the base URL. Okay, so we're using backticks. We're saying that we want to have the base URL slash movie, okay, slash, and then this is gonna be popular, and then we're gonna have question mark API underscore key is equal to, and we're gonna embed inside of a variable our API key. Okay, let me just format this and make it smaller so you guys can see it. Okay, so this is how you send a request to this particular API. You specify the base URL, which is this, and then we said, okay, we want to send to slash movie slash popular, just gives us the popular movies, and we need to give our API key to confirm that we're authorized to send this request. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is say const data is equal to response .json, and we actually need to await this because this is an asynchronous operation, and then we're going to return the data dot results. Okay, so inside of data, it's going to contain a key that says results. The results is going to contain a bunch of movies, and those movies will have things like a title, a release date, and an image, which we'll look at in 1 second. So if we were to actually call this function, you would see that it would take, half a second depends on how long, we're not exactly sure. It's going to fetch the result. We're going to wait until we get the results. We're going to grab the JSON from that, and then we're going to take the results and return that from this function. Okay, now we're gonna do pretty much the same thing here, but now we're gonna do search. So rather than get popular movies, we're gonna say search movies. This time we need to take in a parameter, which is what we're searching for, which will be our query. And we're gonna change the endpoint, so rather than movie slash popular, this is gonna be slash search slash movie. And then as well as our API key, we also need to add at, and then we're gonna say and query is equal to, and then we need to specify a variable here, and this is going to be the encode URI component and then query. Okay, let me just format this so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, so what we're doing is the exact same thing as before, except now we're specifying a query. This query is what we actually want to search for. I'm not going to explain exactly why we need this, but we need to take the query, we need to encode it as a URI component, so it just removes anything from this string that we can't pass in this URL, and then we will be able to get the results, and it will tell us, all of the movies that match that title. Okay, perfect. So that is our search movies and our get popular movies, and that's it for our API file. Now we can simply use the functions that we defined inside of here. Okay, so let's go into home and let's learn about a new thing called useEffect, which is going to allow us to actually use these functions. Okay, so we're gonna start by going to the imports here, and we're just gonna import the two functions that we need. So we're gonna say import, and this is, what did we call it? Search movie. Let's just go back to the file because I forgot what I called it. We called it search movies and get popular movies, okay? So we're gonna say search movies and get popular movies, and this is gonna be from /services/API. Okay, now if we just want to grab all of the movies, if you're new to React, you might think that what we can do is just set our function, so set our variable const movies equal to something like get popular movies. You might think, okay, that'll work, right? I can just call this function, and then it will give me all of the movies. Now, while this will actually work, what will happen is this function will be called every single time that anything in this component changes. Now that's not ideal because we don't want to constantly be fetching movies every single time when really the movies haven't changed and there's no reason to fetch them again. There's a lot of times where we want to do something maybe once right when this component is rendered on the screen, but if any updates happen to the component and we re-render it, we don't want to actually be doing this operation again. So this is where I'm going to show you about something called useEffect. Now, useEffect allows you to add side effects to your functions or to your components and define when they should run. In our case, we just want this to run the first time that this component is rendered. So as soon as it appears on the screen, we'll fetch all of the movies and display them. Okay, so let me show you how we do that. So I'm going to bring in this useEffect hook from React, okay? And what we're going to do now is rather than just having this movies variable, we're actually going to store our movies in state so that it persists, okay? So we're going to say const, and this is going to be movies, and then set movies, and this is going to be equal to use state. For the state, this is just simply going to be a list, okay? So let's just format this. Okay, so now we have movies, set movies. We're storing this in state so that anytime we update the movies list, it will automatically re-render the component for us. Now what we want to do though, is we want to write a useEffect. So the way that useEffect works is you write useEffect as a function, and then you put a function inside of here that you want to call when this array changes. Okay, I know this seems a bit weird, but pretty much we pass a function, and then we pass what's known as a dependency array. Now, whatever we put inside of the dependency array, we're going to check it after every single re-render. And if it's changed since the last time that we rendered, we'll run this useEffect. Now, if there's nothing here, that simply means we're just going to run this one time initially when this component is rendered on screen. Okay, so dependency array, anything inside of here, if any of those values change, we will run the effect again. If you don't have anything inside of here, it will just run one time right when this component is rendered on screen. Then when any state changes occur, this useEffect will not run because nothing's changed in the dependency array. Okay, so this is useful because sometimes if some state changes, for example, you want to run the useEffect again. If that's the case, you can put the state change inside of this dependency array or put the state inside of the dependency array. And if it's updated, then it'll run the useEffect. There's a lot of complex stuff you can do here, but for now, if you just want to run something once, you write it like this. Now, this is very common when you want to, for example, call an API. Right when the component renders, you want to call an API, fetch some data. That's exactly what we're doing and why we're using the useEffect. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually just going to write a function here called load popular movies. Okay, and this is going to be equal to an async function. And inside of the async function, we're going to try to get our movies. So we're going to say try, and we're going to say const popular movies is equal to await and then get popular movies. Okay, get popular movies is the function that we wrote here. Now we need to await this because this is an async function. So we're just waiting until we get the result. Then we're going to say set movies and we're going to set popular movies. Okay, so we're going to take the popular movies and we're going to put them in the state. Now what we also want to do here is we need to have a catch, okay, and a finally block. So we're going to catch some error. And we're going to say finally, because I want to set up some other state as well. So it's very common practice when you're loading something from an API that what you do is you set up two variables or two pieces of state. One to store the loading state, so if we're currently loading data, and one to store any error that potentially occurred when you were calling this API. So what we're going to do is set up some more state. We're going to say const error, and then set error is equal to use state. And then for now, this is going to be null. We're then going to say const loading and set loading. And same thing, this is going to be use state, but this time we're going to set it as true. Now we set it to true because right when we load in this component, we're going to be running this useEffect. So we're going to be loading data. And then inside of the useEffect, we're going to set loading equal to false when we're no longer loading. So inside of the finally, I'm going to say set loading false because whether we had an error or not, well, we are no longer loading. So we'll just say, hey, we're no longer loading. And then inside of the error here, we're going to say set error. And we're just going to set this equal to failed to load movies, ... And we're just going to console.log the error so that we can debug this if something is going wrong. Okay, so console.log err. Perfect. So that's going to load our popular movies, but we need to call this function. So inside of the useEffect, we're going to say load popular movies like that. And now what should happen is when this component is rendered, it calls the API and it loads our movies. Now you can see that that's actually happening. If we scroll through here, we're not seeing the image, but notice that there's a bunch of movies now that are popping up on our screen. So before we go any further, what I want to do is just display the image of the movie. So obviously it looks a little bit better. So to do that, we're going to go into our movie card. Now in the movie card, we're just going to change this a little bit so that we display the correct image. So for our image, rather than displaying movie.url, we're going to display the following, okay? Inside of backticks, this is going to be https://image.tmdb. Okay, let's spell this correctly. .org/t/p/w500. And then we're going to have the $, and then movie.poster_path. Okay. Now I know this is kind of random, but this is just how you get the image. Okay. So this is the URL that you need to put for the source. And when we do the movie poster path, then it will give us obviously a different image for all of the movies. So please just specify this. Again, you can find the code linked in the description. Okay, another thing that we're going to do is notice that we have this like 2024-10-2022. I just want to make this look a little bit nicer. So for my movie release date, I'm just going to add a question mark, then .split at the hyphen, and then I'm just going to take 0. Okay. Now, when I do that, it's just going to display the year for me, which is what I want. Now, if you want the month as well and the day, then you can do that. But I just want to display the year for the movies right now. Okay, so let's go back to home and notice now that we're loading our movies using the useEffect. This useEffect only runs when this component is re-rendered. So if I change something like I like one of these images, or even if I start searching for something, we don't call this again. So now what I want to do is I want to actually display the error state if we do have any error, and I want to display the loading state as well so that we can see if this is currently loading. So what we can do is we can go here to our movies grid and we can start doing some conditional rendering. So what we're going to do is the following. We're going to say, okay, if we are loading question mark, then we're just going to display a paragraph tag, or actually we can display a class name, or yeah, sorry, this is going to be a div with a class name equal to loading. Okay, and then inside the div, we can just say loading ... Okay, and then otherwise we can display the movies grid. Okay, so let me just put the movies grid here and let me format this, and this is what I want. So if we're loading, we want to display loading, otherwise we display the movies grid. Now I'm also going to have some text here, and I'm going to say error and then this is going to be div class name is equal to error-message. Okay, we will end the div, and then inside of here, we can just display what the error message is. So if there is an error, it will appear, and yeah, that's how it works. Now notice if I refresh here, that it kind of takes a second and then these movies fade in. The API is actually very, very fast. You don't really see the fact that it is loading, but it is loading for like a split second, and then the movies appear on screen, okay? Perfect. So that's looking good to me so far, but now we want to make the search field actually work. So how are we going to do that? Let's figure that out. Okay, so inside of handle search, what we need to do now is rather than just displaying what the user typed, we want to actually go and use our search API feature. So we're going to get rid of this alert. And we're going to go down to after e.prevent default. And the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure that the user's searching for something that's not an empty string, because technically they can just use a bunch of spaces here in the search field, and we don't really want them to be able to search if it's a bunch of spaces. So to do that, I can say if not search query. So let's fix this .trim, then return. Now trim just removes all of the spaces from the string, for like all the leading and trailing spaces, not ones in between the words. So it removes all of those for us, so we can make sure that they actually have some characters in the string. Now, if that's the case, and we're actually good, we do have some characters and we're able to search, we're gonna say set loading equal to true, just so that we can indicate on screen, okay, we're currently loading the results. Now, we're also gonna make sure that we aren't doing this if we are loading. So we're gonna say if loading, then return. So this way it won't allow us to search when we're already searching for something else. Perfect. Now after set loading, we're gonna do the same thing that we did before with this try, catch, and finally block, okay? So in the finally, we're always just gonna say set loading equal to false, because whether it failed or was successful, we're no longer loading. In the catch, same thing, we're just gonna say set error, and we're gonna say failed to search movies, ... and then we can just console.log our error. Okay, now in the try, we are going to search for our movie. So we're gonna say const search results is equal to, and then this is gonna be await search movies. And then we are gonna pass inside of here our search query. Now we're getting an error with await. That's because we need to have an async function here in order to use this keyword. So we can just change this function to be async, and now it should work. Okay, now after we get our search results, we'll just say set movies, and then this is gonna be the search results. And then we're also just gonna say set error, and then null. So that if we did have an error before, then we clear that error when we load it this time. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but that should actually be all that we need for this search. If we want, we can then set the search string to empty after we press the search button, but we don't need to do that. It's up to us if we want to set it to empty or not. So I'm just gonna leave it the same. Okay, so let's go here and let's search for a movie like Terminator, okay? And when I press search, you can see it takes a second, it's loading, and then it shows me the Terminator movies on screen. And notice if we make this bigger, we can see them kind of all in a row here. For some reason, some of them don't have images, but most of them do. Okay, perfect. So that is that. We're now loading data from the API. Let me try to get this back here on my screen, okay? And what is next? Well, I believe what we need to do next is we need to make this favorite button work. And in order to make the favorite button work, I actually want this to persist across runs of my application. So right now, for example, if I refresh, like the whole state of my application just resets back to what it was at originally. But what I want to do is I want to actually store the movies that we favorite, that we select as one of our favorites, permanently. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to show you how we can store the movies that we favorited in something known as local storage. This is storage kind of contained within your browser. And I'm going to show you how we can use something known as a React context. So in our current example here, we have some state, right? Now this state really only matters when we're on the home page. If I change over to the favorites page, it doesn't really matter and we don't use it, right? It's just relevant to the current page that we're on. However, sometimes, and in this example, we have state that we want to have on both the favorites page and the home page, or in multiple places in our app. Now, if that's the case, there's different techniques for kind of sharing this state between different pages or different components, but a way to do this that's a lot friendlier than something known as prop drilling, which means kind of taking the state and just constantly passing it through props of different components you're rendering, is to use something known as a context. Now, a context will allow state to be globally available to anything that's within the provided context. I know this doesn't make a ton of sense right now because I'm not showing you an example, but in this situation, we want to know what movies are our favorite when we're on the home page, as well as when we're on the favorites page. The reason for that is that each movie is going to have like this little heart icon, right? And we want it to be red if it's favorited, and we want it to be white if it's not favorited. So on the home page or in the movie component, we need to know if this movie is a favorite. And then on the favorites page in a different component, we also need to know if the movie's a favorite. We need to know what all of the favorites are. So how do we do that? Because we have the same state and we need that on two different pages. So that's what I'm going to show you kind of how we fix here, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new folder called contexts, okay? Now inside of here, we're going to specify the favorite context. I think that's what I called it, or no, let's actually go with movie context, okay? .jsx. Now, what we're about to write here is not necessarily a component, even though it kind of looks like one. What it's really meant to do is provide some global state and some helper functions that we can use from multiple places within our application. So this is kind of the state manager for our favorite movies. That's the way that we can think about it, okay? So we're going to start by importing create context, okay? Use state, use context, and use effect from React. Okay, then we're going to create a context. So we're going to say const movie context is equal to create context. Now we're going to say export const, and then this is going to be use movie context. Okay, and this is going to be equal to a function, and this is going to have the use context hook, and it's going to use the function that we're about to define. So we're going to say export const movie provider is equal to a function, and then we're going to put the movie context here. Okay, so I know I went fast here, but what's going to happen in a second is we're going to write this movie provider. Now, this provider is going to provide state to any of the components that are wrapped inside of it. So what it does is it just kind of sits on top of them or around them, really, and it allows them to hook into or get access to specific functions or specific state when they need to use it. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our entire app in this movie provider context, which you're going to see in 1 second, and that's going to allow the entire app to have access to some state that we define. Now, before we go any further, I can show you an example of this already working. So if we look in main.jsx here, notice that we have this browser router. Now, this browser router acts like a context that will then take the entire application and give the whole app access to the ability to use the slash routes, right? To go to different pages, to navigate in the application. Now, that's not exactly how it works, but you can think of it like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to write our own feature just like that, our own movie context. We're then going to wrap the app in that movie provider or that movie context. So now any of the components in our app can access this state, and they can see, for example, what movies are our favorite. So what we're going to do is we're going to take in what's known as children. Now, children is a reserved prop when you write a component, and children is anything that's inside of the component that you rendered. Now, for example, the browser router has children equal to app because we put this app component inside of the browser router. So even though we didn't manually define, hey, like, children is equal to this, because the app is inside of the component, it becomes a child and gets added to this children prop. So what we're doing is we're defining this children property, and then we can use that, and anything that's put inside of this provider will be treated as children. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say return, and then this is going to be movie context dot provider. Okay, and inside of here, we're just going to render our children. Okay, so now what we can do is we can start defining all of the logic and the state related to our favorite movies. So we're going to create some state, and we're going to say const favorites, and then set favorites, if we can write this correctly, is equal to use state. And inside of here, we can just write a component like we normally would. The only difference is what's going to happen is anything that's inside of here, so any of the children, will just have access to all of the state that we provide inside of this component, okay? This is really referred to as a context, but you'll see how it works as we keep going. I understand it's very confusing right now because it does require a more advanced example. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use something known as local storage. Local storage just allows us to store values directly within our browser, and we can just store strings, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to have a useEffect. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look inside of our local storage and see if we already have any favorite movies. So we're going to say const stored, and then this will just be faves is equal to local storage dot get item, and we can store items based on different string keys. Okay, so we're going to use the key favorites in our local storage, and that's what we're going to look at. So we're going to say, hey, we want to get the item favorites, and we want to see if there are any favorite movies currently in there. So we're going to say if stored faves, so if there is actually anything inside of there, we're going to say set favorites, and we're going to set this equal to json.parse, and then the stored faves. Now, what we're doing is we're actually going to store our information or all of our favorite movies in a list, and that list is going to be converted first into a JSON string. So we're going to store it as a JSON string in local storage because local storage can only store strings. So then when we want to actually read it in, we're going to convert it from the JSON string, which is simply a list or an array, back into a real JavaScript object, which is what json.parse does, and then set that as our favorites. I know that's a little bit confusing, but pretty much we'll take the string. So it's going to be like this, like a string with a list of IDs of our favorite movies. And we just want to convert it into a normal, sorry, I keep saying list, but I mean array. So that's what json.parse will do. Okay, so that's the useEffect. Now we also are going to have another useEffect. And for this useEffect, we're going to use this dependency array. And we're going to say favorites. And we're going to say local storage, okay, dot set item. And we're going to set item favorites equal to JSON, but this time it's going to be dot stringify the favorites. Okay, so what we're saying here is anytime this favorite state changes, we want to update what we're storing in local storage. So that's how this useEffect works. It only runs when the favorites changes. So anytime we add a favorite or remove a favorite, this useEffect hook is going to run. And then we're going to set in local storage the favorites key, and we're going to be storing the new kind of version of our favorites. All right, now we take the favorites, which is an array, and we convert it into a string. So that's why here we need to do the reverse operation where we take the string and we convert it back to an array. Okay, so those are our two useEffects. But there's three main operations that we need to have inside of here. One operation to add to the favorites, obviously, one to remove from the favorites, and one to check if something is a favorite. So we're going to say const add to favorites is equal to, we're going to take in a movie, and we're going to say set favorites. Now, if we're dealing with state here, and we have something like an array, like a mutable type, and we want to actually add a new value into the array, it's not as simple as me just doing what I would normally do in JavaScript and doing something, you know, like favorites dot push. If I do this, it's not actually going to update the state because we need to use this function to update the state so that React knows that the state was changed. So what we can do if we want to get access to the previous value of the state, so what it's currently equal to, and then adjust that, is we can do something like this. I can say prev. Okay, this is going to give me the previous value, and then I can use the previous value. So I can say dot 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 previous, and I can simply add inside of here my movie. Okay, so we say, all right, take the previous value. This is all of our favorites currently. So either an empty array or any of the favorites we have. We're going to get all of those, put them inside of here, and then we're going to add the new movie. This is how you update state when you're doing it with an array, for example, and you want to add a value to the array. Okay, so that's all you need to do to add favorites. But now we want to remove favorite. So we're going to say remove from favorites. Okay, same thing. We're going to take in this time a movie ID. And what we're going to do is say set favorites. Same thing. We need to take in our previous. Okay, and then we're going to say previous dot filter. And we're going to say movie. And then movie dot ID does not equal movie ID. So all this is doing is generating a new array for us where we only contain all of the movies that are not equal to the one that we want to remove. So we're going to say const is favorite. Okay, we're going to take in a movie ID, and then we're going to say return favorites dot sum. This just tells us if one of these conditions is true, and we're going to say movie, and then this is going to be movie dot ID is equal to movie ID. Okay, so this just checks all of the movie IDs in our favorites, sees if one of them are equal to the movie ID that we're looking at. If it is, we return true, otherwise we will return false. Okay, now we wrote these three different functions and we also wrote this state. But if we want this to be accessible to any of the children that are wrapped inside of this provider, then we need to provide a value in the provider. So what we can do is we can say const value is equal to, and we can specify in a JavaScript object all of the values that we want to provide to the children. So we can say favorites, add to favorites, remove from favorites, and is favorite. Now I can say value is equal to value. Okay, this is a keyword that you can provide in your provider. And now anything that's inside of here can access all of the values inside of this object. Okay, so we just created this React context. Again, I appreciate that this is not the clearest example in the world. Hopefully it's making a little bit of sense though. We're defining all of the state that we want to be globally available to anything inside of these children. And now all we need to do is use this context. And when we use the context, we're able to kind of hook into it and grab all of this global state. Okay, so how do we do that? First of all, let me just save main.jsx. And let me go here to app.jsx because I'm going to wrap this in my context. Okay, so for app.jsx, we're going to import the movie provider. So I'm going to say import, and then this is going to be movie provider from the movie context, okay? And then rather than having a div, I'm just gonna specify the movie provider and then slash movie provider. Now that's it. So now that I've wrapped this, I can access that state from any of the components in here. So first we're gonna go to our movie card. Okay, so in our movie card, we're gonna start using some of that state in order to update our movies and favorite them. Because right now we're just saying, hey, we clicked on them. We don't wanna do that. We actually wanna update and say, yes, we are, favorite it. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna say import, and this is gonna be use movie context from the movie context. Then we can say const is favorite, add to favorites, and remove from favorites from the use movie context. Sorry, is equal to the use movie context. Okay, so again, if we just go to this here, you can see that we have this use movie context. We're using this context. And now what I'm able to do is when I go here and I call this function, it pretty much just gives me access to all of these different values. Now, if I wanted the favorites as well, I could get the favorites. I don't need to get all of them, but I can just take any of the values that are provided here in this provider. Okay, that's how it works. So we made this provider, we wrapped all of our content with it, and now from any component, as long as it's inside of there, and it is because we wrapped the entire app in it, we're able to grab values by using this hook. So you say, hey, I need some state. Okay, so I'm gonna grab all the piece of state that I need from use movie context. Now these are functions that will then update the state in the context. So anywhere else globally in our app, we have access to those changes. Now, first thing we're gonna do is just say const favorite is equal to is favorite, and then we're just gonna pass the movie.id. Now this is simply gonna tell us if we are currently favorited or not. And if we are favorited, we want to actually change one of the classes on our button to make it red. Okay, so we're gonna have favorite button, and then we're actually gonna change this to be backticks. And when we do that, we just need to specify the braces here because this is gonna be an expression. And then we're gonna do a space, and we're gonna write an expression inside of a variable. We're gonna say favorite. If that's true, then we want to put the class active. Otherwise, we want to put an empty string. Okay, so we're just saying, hey, if we are favorited, add this active class to the class name. So then this will become red. Okay. Now inside of our on favorite click, we just need to make it so that if we're currently favorited, we unfavorite this, but if we're not favorited, then we favorite it. So we're gonna start by saying E, we're gonna take an E here. We're gonna say E.prevent default, just prevent the default behavior of the button. We're gonna say if favorite, then we are gonna remove from favorites the movie.id. Otherwise, we're gonna say add to favorites the movie. Okay, so we're gonna save that and refresh. And now we should see if we press on this button that it gets highlighted in red. And notice it stays red. Same with this one. If I press it again, it goes from red to white. Okay, now that's great, but we don't actually know if the favorite state is being updated properly until we start displaying it on the favorites page, because right now we're not displaying that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to favorites, okay? And inside of favorites, we're gonna render a grid of all of our favorite movies, but only if we have any. Okay, so let's go into the favorites page, and we're gonna start by grabbing our favorites. So same thing as before, we're gonna say import, and then this is gonna be the use movie context, okay? We are then also gonna say import the movie card from our components, and we're gonna go up here and we're gonna say const favorites is equal to the use movie context like this. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna say if favorites, then we want to return, and we're gonna return a movies grid. And in fact, what we can do is we can go to our homepage and we can just copy what we're displaying here. So you can see we have this movies grid. So let's copy that. Let's bring it to favorites, paste it here. But rather than movies.map, we're just gonna say favorites.map, okay? Because we're gonna map all of our favorites, not all of the movies. Otherwise, we can display this. And I think that should actually be good, but I'm just gonna wrap this in one more div actually, just so that we can have like a nice header. So I'm gonna add another div, and I'm gonna say h2, and we will just say your favorites Okay, like that. And then we'll just add a class name here. I'm gonna say class name is equal to favorites, and that's fine. Okay, and let me just format this so it looks a little bit nicer. Sweet. So now let's go to our favorites, and you can see that it shows us our favorite movies. And if I unfavorite one of them, gets removed, unfavorite, gets removed, and you see that it's showing up here. Now this is quite large. This is larger than I was expecting it to be, but that's fine. I probably just messed up some CSS somewhere. So if I add a few more favorites and we go back here, you can see now the favorites are appearing in our grid. Sweet. So that is pretty much it. I mean, that's going to wrap up our application. I taught you guys a lot of stuff about React here. We went through useState, useEffect, calling APIs. We went through context. We went through JSX, conditional rendering, setting up the React application, error handling, loading states, a lot of stuff in this video. And I recognize that not all of this is going to be 100% clear, but I wanted to try to teach you as much as I possibly could, as fast as I possibly could. So all of this code will be available from the link in the description. If you appreciate this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.